The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer, a sound Katie Morrison had learned to stop hearing 2 years ago. She moved through Oak Creek Memorial like water finding cracks in concrete, present but unnoticed, efficient but invisible. 7:32 in the morning. The surgical wing wasn't crowded yet. Just the way she preferred it. Her badge clipped to pale blue scrubs that fit her frame like they'd been tailored for someone else. She'd borrowed them from the Lost and Found in 2022 and never returned them. The scrubs hung loose enough to hide the way her left shoulder rode slightly lower than her right, loose enough that no one asked why she winced when reaching overhead to stock the top shelves of the supply room. Katie pushed the metal cart down the hallway, its wheels squeaking against the polished floor like small accusations. 3 years of night shifts in the 82nd Airborne had taught her how to move through spaces without disturbing the air. You learn to be small. You learn to be forgettable. You learned that the most dangerous people in any room were the ones nobody remembered seeing. The supply room door hung slightly ajar. She'd propped it open with her foot 15 minutes earlier, restocking for lines and trauma dressing packs with the kind of meticulous precision that made the other nurses uncomfortable. They'd watch her fold bandages and secure sterile trays, and they'd mention, always in that careful tone, that she seemed to anticipate what would be needed before anyone asked. One of them had said it last week, "You move like you're expecting a code." Katie had simply nodded and continued organizing the 18-gauge angiocath needles by expiration date. She didn't expect codes. She prepared for them. There was a difference. The hallway behind her was empty. The day shift hadn't arrived yet. She could hear the distant sound of a monitor alarm in Trauma Bay 3, someone's heart rate spiking, the steady beep-beep-beep of a machine doing the job humans couldn't do alone. The antiseptic smell of the hospital, a mixture of bleach and something chemical she'd never bothered to identify, filled her nostrils. After 2 years, it no longer made her think of field hospitals. Most days. Katie reached for a box of surgical gloves from the cart when she noticed the medication storage cabinet was open. Not just open. The door hung at an angle that suggested someone had been in a hurry or had wanted to appear casual about accessing something they shouldn't access casually. She didn't look up. Looking up would require acknowledgement. Acknowledgement required explanation, and explanation required truth. Katie had built her entire existence at Oak Creek Memorial on the principle of explaining nothing. But her eyes moved to the crack in the supply room door anyway. Dr. Ashford stood at the medication cart with his back to her, wearing one of those expensive dress shirts that cost more than her weekly groceries. The kind of shirt that looked wrong in a hospital because it suggested someone who didn't expect to get blood on themselves. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, left hand steadying a blue-labeled vial of preoperative sedative, right hand producing an unmarked bottle from his coat pocket that caught the fluorescent light like a secret. The swap took approximately 4 seconds. Katie's breath didn't change. Her heart rate didn't spike. She'd learned long ago that the body was a traitor if you let it be. Control the breath. Control the heartbeat. Control the impulse to react, and you controlled everything. Dr. Ashford's hands were steady. Professional. This wasn't his first time. That detail registered and filed itself away in the part of her brain trained to notice what didn't fit. The vial he'd taken, the legitimate one, he pocketed with the same casual confidence he might use to pocket his phone. Then he turned. Their eyes met across the 6 feet of hallway that separated the medication cart from the supply room doorway. For a moment that stretched like pulled taffy, neither of them moved. Katie's hand was still raised toward the shelf, a box of surgical gloves suspended in midair like she'd been frozen mid-motion. She wasn't frozen. She'd never been frozen in her life. But she was still. Dr. Ashford's expression shifted. A flicker of something, surprise, calculation, threat assessment, crossed his face like a shadow. His eyes were the color of wet concrete, and they held the particular coldness of someone accustomed to believing that rules were decorative suggestions other people lived by. Katie lowered her hand. She didn't look away, but she didn't acknowledge what she'd seen either. She simply turned back to her cart and continued placing surgical gloves on the shelf, her movements unchanged, her breathing unchanged, her entire body language suggesting that she'd seen nothing, understood nothing, would remember nothing. "Morrison!" Dr. Ashford's voice carried across the hallway like a command, not a greeting. It wasn't a request. "You're here early." Katie completed placing the box of gloves on the shelf. Then she turned to face him, her posture neutral, her expression the practiced blankness she'd perfected over 23 months. "Supply count," she said quietly. "We're short on 14-gauge needles." It wasn't true. They weren't short on anything. But it was the kind of mundane, forgettable detail that people accepted without question. A nurse managing stock. Nothing remarkable. Nothing threatening. Nothing worth remembering. Dr. Ashford studied her for 2 more seconds. His jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly, but Katie had spent 12 years with people whose micro-expressions determined whether you lived or died. She saw it. She filed it away. "Carry on," he said finally. He turned and walked down the hallway toward the surgeon's lounge, his expensive shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of someone who'd never learned how to move quietly. Katie waited until the sound of those shoes faded completely. Then she returned to the supply cart. Her hands resumed their methodical work, restocking trauma dressing packs, organizing epinephrine auto-injectors, aligning the 500 cubic centimeters bags of saline with military precision. Each movement was automatic. Muscle memory. The same muscle memory that had once allowed her to secure and fall line in the back of a Black Hawk flying low over Tikrit, altitude dropping fast, rounds tearing through the fuselage like angry wasps. But that Katie was gone. That Katie had been discharged with a medical rating that meant she'd never run another trauma code, never lead a team again, never be the person people looked to when the bleeding wouldn't stop and the clock was running down. The shrapnel near her spine made sure of that. The doctors had been very clear: sedentary work. Light duty. Administrative preferred. She'd become a nurse instead. The morning light was beginning to shift through the high windows of the supply room, that pale Norfolk sunrise that came too late and left too early. Katie organized the last of the supplies and wheeled the cart back toward its designated spot near the nurse's station. She passed the medication cabinet where Dr. Ashford had stood. The cabinet was closed now, locked, probably, though she wouldn't check. What she'd seen was already gone. Overwritten. Forgotten. Except it wasn't. It would never be forgotten. Katie Morrison didn't forget anything. The plasticity of her memory was either a gift or a curse depending on the day, and on most days it felt like both simultaneously. She hung her jacket in her locker, the one with the faded Special Forces unit patch barely visible through a torn seam in the lining, a patch no one ever mentioned because no one ever noticed it, and clipped her badge back to her scrubs. The day shift was beginning to arrive now, nurses with coffee and conversations and the kind of ease that came from not having survived anything worse than a bad relationship or a difficult shift supervisor. Katie moved toward the surgical wing. There was first stock to verify, trauma trays to check, equipment to inspect. There was the work that filled her days and made her necessary and kept her invisible all at once. The next words that would reach her ears wouldn't come until the morning shift coordinator called out her name over the PA system, and by that time everything would have changed in ways Katie was only beginning to understand. The PA system crackled at 8:41 a.m. on a Tuesday, the sound cutting through the surgical floor like a blade. Kitty cat to administration. Kitty cat to administration. Katie felt it before she heard it, the collective shift in attention, every head at the nurse's station turning in unison to watch her. The nickname hung in the air like something toxic, something that turned her from a person into a mascot, stripped her down to something small and manageable and wrong. She set down her chart without hurrying, moved from the station with the same steady pace she'd used walking patrols through Tikrit's eastern district, the kind of walk that showed nothing. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. She could feel their eyes following her down the corridor, past the supply closet where she'd seen Dr. Ashford's hands moving with practiced efficiency, swapping one set of vials for another, and she wondered if he was waiting for her now, if this walk was part of something he'd already calculated. The administration office smelled like old leather and coffee gone cold. Dr. Ashford sat behind an oak desk that cost more than she made in 3 months, his fingers steepled in a posture of concern so perfect it had to be rehearsed. He gestured for her to sit. She remained standing. "Your performance has been substandard, Katie." His voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who'd given this speech before, who knew exactly how to make kindness sound like a knife. "I'm recommending a transfer to night shift in geriatrics. Effective immediately." She took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned in combat medicine, the kind that steadied your hands before you had to save someone's life. "I've had perfect evaluations for 2 years. He shuffled papers with theatrical care. "Recent observations suggest otherwise." He didn't look at her when he said it. That was the tell, he couldn't maintain eye contact while lying. His discomfort was a small victory, but she didn't let it show on her face. "The night shift will be better suited to your clinical skill set." Katie Morrison, Major Morrison, though no one here knew that, had watched officers try to intimidate soldiers with bureaucratic language for 12 years. She'd seen it fail every time. "When do I start?" That night, after her final day shift, Dr. Ashford materialized in the surgical wing hallway as if he'd been waiting. The supply closet was 3 feet away. He positioned himself between her and it, blocking the door like he owned the space, like his body was an institution unto itself. "The night shift will be quieter for you," he said, his voice dropping into something that might have been sympathy if it wasn't so precisely calculated. "A chance to regroup. Unless you'd prefer to discuss other options." She understood what he meant. Other options meant silence. Other options meant walking away from whatever she'd seen, or at least pretending she had. Other options meant letting him win. Katie met his gaze steadily, held it long enough to watch his jaw tighten, long enough for him to understand that she wasn't looking away. "I'll take the transfer." He stepped back, and she moved past him into the supply closet. Behind her, his footsteps retreated. But she felt the weight of what was coming, the pressure building like a barometer before a storm. When she emerged, she was still composed, still steady, still perfectly invisible to everyone who didn't know what to look for. Still, as she walked to her car that evening, a single tear slid down her cheek, not from fear, but from fury that she was controlling so carefully it hurt. She pressed it away with one precise motion and kept walking. 3 weeks in geriatrics felt like 3 years compressed into 504 hours. Night shift in a wing where time moved differently, where the residents confused her for their daughter or their nurse from decades past, where she handed out medications and changed bedding and felt her hands forgetting the language they'd spoken in trauma bays and field hospitals where the difference between precision and hesitation meant someone lived or died. She moved through the darkness of the geriatric ward like a ghost haunting her own life, checking vitals, documenting decline, watching people wait for endings. But that wasn't the worst part. That night came 3 weeks in, at 2:13 a.m., when the overhead system crackled with different urgency. Trauma alert. Gunshot victim. ETA 5 minutes. All hands to emergency. Katie's body moved before her mind caught up. Muscle memory had its own intelligence. She was already moving toward the emergency department when a charge nurse stepped into her path, clipboard raised like a shield. "Aides stay on their floors, Morrison." The words landed like a physical blow, not because of the content but because of the timing. She stopped, watching through the hallway window as the ambulance bay doors erupted into motion, as the trauma team assembled with the choreography of people who'd done this hundreds of times. She watched the stretcher come through, watched blood pooling beneath a man whose face was obscured by oxygen masks and the chaos of stabilization. And then something in his profile stopped her breath. His shoulder. The way he was built. The shape of his hands even as they lay limp at his sides. 8 years dissolved. She recognized him not from a name but from the weight of shared survival, from a field hospital in Tikrit where she'd stitched someone together with shaking hands and will and prayers she didn't believe in. She'd held him. She'd kept his organs where they belonged and his blood inside his body and his consciousness anchored to the world. He'd been alive last time she saw him, moving, breathing on his own. Now he was coding. Katie pushed through the emergency department doors. The residents around the trauma bay were shouting conflicting orders, fumbling, their hands moving with the hesitation of people who trained in theory but never learned what it felt like to watch someone die on your watch. The man's chest wound was sucking air with each labored breath, pneumothorax building, pressure in the chest cavity that would collapse his lungs. She didn't think. Her hands had done this before in conditions far worse, in the dust and heat of a place where there was no backup. She grabbed the MRE pouch protruding from his jacket pocket, tore it open with her teeth, and converted the plastic packaging into an improvised chest seal, the same technique she performed 17 times in Tikrit, the same motion that had saved lives when commercial equipment wasn't available. The plastic was slick against her fingers, the air around her moving with terrible speed. 14-gauge needle. Now. Her voice didn't ask. It commanded. Someone bag him. Someone get me type O negative and start a second line. The residents froze for one fatal second, then scattered. A nurse she'd never worked with before was already prepping the needle. Katie found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomy that lived in her muscle memory like her own heartbeat, and inserted the decompression needle. The hiss of air escaping was music. The sound of pressure releasing. Of a body remembering how to breathe. 90 seconds later, his oxygen saturation climbed. 68 to 74 to 82. The cardiac monitor steadied from the chaotic electrical storm of ventricular fibrillation back toward something resembling sinus rhythm. The man stabilized. His hands relaxed. His breathing deepened. Katie stepped back, her hands trembling not from fear but from the adrenaline flood of a body that still remembered this work, still knew how to move through crisis like someone born to it. She was breathing hard, the fluorescent lights too bright, the smell of blood and antiseptic and ozone from the defibrillator pads thick in the air around her. And then she saw him. Dr. Ashford, standing in the doorway, his face unreadable as stone. Their eyes met across the trauma bay. He saw what she'd just done. More than that, he saw who she was. And for one moment, Katie Morrison understood that she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd revealed herself, moved with an authority that no nurse's aide should possess, saved a life with the kind of precision that came from experience he couldn't explain away in a staff meeting. Within the hour, she found herself reassigned. Not a night shift in geriatrics, that would be too obvious. Now she was inventory duty. Basement supply room. The fluorescent lights down there hummed with a different quality, a lower frequency that made her teeth ache. She was cataloging 4 lines and bandage boxes and saline solutions when she heard footsteps on the concrete stairs. She didn't look up. She already knew who it would be. She already understood what was coming next. But that wasn't the real nightmare. That came later, when she realized he'd seen everything and that he was going to make absolutely certain she never got close to another patient as long as she worked at Oak Creek Memorial. 3 weeks in geriatrics felt like 3 years in a sensory deprivation tank. Katie pushed the medication cart down the hallway at 11 p.m., her hands dispensing pills into tiny paper cups with the precision of someone who'd once stabilized a femoral artery bleed with a combat tourniquet and duct tape. Now she was counting out metformin tablets for Mrs. Chen in for 12, listening to the old woman stories about grandchildren while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Her trauma nursing skills were atrophying. She could feel them rusting, like weapons left in the rain. The other night shift nurses didn't speak to her. Ashford had made that clear to everyone during the department huddle on her first evening, a cool mention that Katie Morrison had overstepped her scope of practice in the ER, that she needed additional supervision, that maybe the geriatric floor was a better fit for someone with her performance issues. The message was delivered with a smile. The message landed like a body bag. She kept her head down. Made beds. Answered call lights at 2 a.m. from residents who couldn't remember where they were. The faded unit patch inside her jacket lining felt heavier each shift, like it was pressing down on her chest, reminding her of what she'd given up and what she'd lost by coming here in the first place. Hidden identities were supposed to stay hidden. She'd done this before, 3 years undercover in a DEA task force before the shrapnel near her spine changed the calculus of her entire existence. At 2:13 a.m. on a Wednesday night, the trauma alarm exploded through the intercom. Not a page. The alarm. The one that meant incoming trauma, ETA 5 minutes, all hands on deck. Katie's body moved before her brain caught up. She was already moving toward the nursing station when the dispatcher's voice crackled through. GSW, gunshot wound to left anterior chest, male, mid-30s, active hemorrhage, extrication in progress, ETA 4 minutes to Oak Creek Memorial Trauma Bay. Mrs. Chen's Ambien could wait. The residents in 412, 413, 414 could wait. The trauma bay couldn't. The ER was a controlled chaos of movement, nurses pulling supplies, the attending surgeon scrubbing in, the trauma team assembling like a military operation, which it essentially was. Katie stood in the doorway, watching, and then she saw him. The patient wheeled through the automatic doors on a stretcher, paramedics bagging him, his chest wrapped in nothing but bloody gauze that was failing by the second. Chest wound. Hemorrhagic shock written across his pale face. His left anterior chest, the wound site was already turning dark, blood soaking through the trauma dressing. He needed a seal. He needed it now. His eyes opened for a fraction of a second as they rolled him past the nursing station, and Katie saw it. Recognition. 8 years since Tikrit. 8 years since the Phi base in Loga province where Captain, then Lieutenant, Reeves had pulled her out of an IED crater with one arm while returning fire with the other. She'd stitched him back together in the field hospital with morphine and will and trembling hands that weren't supposed to tremble. He'd survived. Somehow, impossibly, he'd survived. And now he was bleeding out in front of her in Norfolk. The charge nurse was calling for volunteers. Katie didn't volunteer. She simply appeared at the trauma bay door, and the attending looked up and said, "We need another set of hands," and before anyone could say no, she was already gloved up, already moving, already becoming someone other than the invisible woman who'd been counting metformin tablets 2 minutes ago. The patient's oxygen saturation was 68 and dropping. His systolic was 74. His airway was patent but his breathing was shallow, labored, the sound of air moving through fluid instead of lungs. Pneumothorax. The left lung had collapsed. The combat boots she wore under her scrubs, boots that hadn't touched combat soil in 8 years, seemed to root her to the ground with absolute authority. Her voice dropped 2 registers. Move him left. I need access to the right side. 14-gauge angiocath. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and the 2 ER nurses moved without hesitation because her voice had the weight of someone who'd given orders while explosions detonated in adjacent compounds. But what he needed, what was killing him faster than any fluids could replace, was a seal on that chest wound. A seal that would keep air from collapsing his lung further, that would stop the internal hemorrhaging from turning into massive exsanguination in the next 90 seconds. Katie's eyes moved across the trauma bay and landed on his jacket, crumpled on the metal cart beside the stretcher. She grabbed it, ignored the attending's raised eyebrow, and found what she was looking for, an MRE, a meals ready-to-eat pouch, the kind she'd eaten in the field for 6 straight years. Beef ravioli. Flameless heater. Dessert she'd never bothered with. Her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory. She tore the MRE wrapper, pulled out the thick plastic, wiped it clean against her scrub pants, and with one smooth motion sealed it over the wound using surgical tape from the trauma kit. The plastic adhered to the raw skin around the entrance wound, creating a one-way valve. Air could escape, but nothing could get back in. The lung had a fighting chance. O2 sat climbing. 72. 78. 85. The attending was watching her like she'd materialized from a parallel dimension. Who trained you? Katie didn't answer. She was already moving to draw up a second line, her hands steady as surgical lasers, her eyes reading the cardiac monitor like it was the only language that mattered. Sinus rhythm. Tachycardic but holding. The patient was going to live long enough to get to the OR. Trauma surgeon is 5 minutes out, the charge nurse said, still staring at Katie. "She's prepping the operating room now." The attending had a new expression on his face. Recognition, but not the good kind. The kind that meant questions would follow. Questions Katie couldn't answer with the truth. The attending, Dr. Reeves, the name badge read, his eyes fluttered open for just a moment as they prepped him for transport to surgery. He saw her. He knew. His lips moved but no sound came out, just the faintest shape his mouth made, "Major." Then Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway of the trauma bay, and the entire room's energy shifted. He was still in scrubs from his earlier cases, his surgical mask hanging around his neck like a stethoscope, his face carrying an expression of pleasant concern that didn't reach his eyes. He took in the scene in exactly 2 seconds: Katie's hands, her positioning, the chest seal she'd improvised, the ER team's deference to her, and the patient's barely conscious recognition of her. "Good work, everyone," Ashford said, his voice smooth as silk over broken glass. "Katie, thank you for assisting. Once we're finished here, there's an inventory count waiting in the basement storage. The supplies from the last shipment need to be logged." It wasn't a request. It was a trap disguised as a task assignment. Katie looked at him directly. Their eyes met for 3 full seconds. She saw him calculate his next move, saw him decide that witnesses couldn't be allowed near recovered trauma patients, that patient statements about Major Morrison couldn't be corroborated, that the patient needed to be positioned where only compliant staff had access. "Of course, Dr. Ashford," she said, her voice deferential, her hands already moving away from the trauma cart. She was being excused from the operating room, excused from patient follow-up, excused from the only place in the hospital where her actual value meant anything. The inventory count was on the basement level, in a storage room with no windows and only one door. Katie descended the stairs at 3:36 a.m. and began logging bandage boxes and 4 fluid bags into a spreadsheet that nobody had ever cared about before. At 4:12 a.m., she heard Dr. Ashford's voice above her on the hospital intercom system, calling a meeting with the surgical department, his tone all professional urgency. She heard him tell the operating surgeons that he'd filed a formal report with administration about Katie's unauthorized intervention in the ER, that she'd overstepped her authority, that her insubordination was a liability the hospital could no longer tolerate. Then she heard his footsteps move past the storage room to his office, and the door closed almost all the way, just a crack remaining, and his voice dropped to something meant to sound private but carried down the stairwell like a knife. "No, I understand. Yes, I'm documenting everything. The performance issues have been consistent. Her presence on the floor is a liability. I need her gone, and I need it done before that patient becomes stable enough to make statements." Exactly. The transfer was just the first step. Now we proceed with formal termination. Friday. I'm recommending immediate termination on grounds of insubordination. She won't have a leg to stand on. Katie counted bandage boxes. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each count was a heartbeat. Each heartbeat was a reminder that she'd already lost so much, her commission, her unit, her place in the world that valued what she could actually do. The storage room smelled like cardboard and industrial cleaner and defeat. At 5:38 a.m., Dr. Ashford descended the stairs one final time. He didn't enter the storage room. He simply stood at the doorway, looking at Katie surrounded by inventory boxes, and smiled. "You look tired, Major," he stopped himself, laughed quietly. "Katie. I mean Katie. You should get some rest. You have a long week ahead of you." He emphasized the word major. It was a test. A dangerous, calculated test to see if she'd react, if she'd correct him, if she'd reveal that she'd been conscious of his word choice all along. Katie didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply set down the clipboard and said, "Yes, Dr. Ashford. I'll finish the count and head home." She waited until his footsteps reached the top of the stairs, until the door closed behind him, until the storage room was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of a woman breathing in the dark. Then she looked at her hands, still stained with another man's blood, blood that meant he was alive because she'd remembered how to do something nobody at Oak Creek Memorial was supposed to know she could do. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came the next morning when the charge nurse pulled Katie aside and told her that the patient, that trauma victim, that man whose blood she'd sealed back into his chest, had asked specifically for Major Morrison when he woke up in recovery. The charge nurse had checked his file. His emergency contact was listed as military personnel. The background check had flagged classified security clearance. Someone was going to explain what that meant. And Dr. Ashford was going to make absolutely certain it wasn't Katie. The patient's voice cut through the afternoon shift like a blade nobody saw coming. Stable now, lucid, his eyes finding the charge nurse as she adjusted his full line. Why is Major Morrison counting bandages in the basement? His words were soft, but they traveled. Down the hallway. Into the break room. Across the nurse's station where 3 RNs froze mid-conversation. Major Morrison. Not just Morrison. Not Katie. Major. The charge nurse's pen stopped moving. She turned back to the patient. What? He was already struggling to sit higher. The woman who saved my life 3 weeks ago. Combat medic. Tikrit. I know my own people. Where is she? The question spread like infection through the ward, each retelling adding weight, adding certainty. She had known him. She had treated him without hesitation. She had used techniques nobody else here would recognize. The nurses began comparing notes in urgent whispers. The older RN who'd worked trauma for 11 years pulled up the duty roster. Katie Morrison. Night shift. Inventory. Basement level 2. The pieces were assembling themselves, and Katie could feel it happening even from 3 floors below. Dr. Ashford felt it too. He was in his office when the whispers reached him, not the words themselves, but the frequency, the cadence of discovery. His hand moved with the precision of a man who'd rehearsed this moment. He pulled the master schedule from his desk drawer. 47 minutes until end of shift. He called administration. I need Katie Morrison's access to the surgical wing revoked effective immediately. Site security protocols. No explanation. He waited while the typing happened on the other end. Confirmed. He made a second call to a contact at the state board. I'm documenting a pattern of insubordination and safety violations. I'm faxing her incident file. We may need to escalate if she contests her termination. The words were measured, reasonable, the kind of words that shut down questions. He'd learned years ago that competence wasn't about being right. It was about sounding right. He cancelled her surgical wing access. He reassigned her patient care certifications. He made her disappear from the system not with violence but with bureaucracy, each action stamped and authorized and deniable, the paperwork spreading across desks like a slow-moving fog that no single person could point to and say was his doing. The hospital laundry room at 4:17 p.m. was empty except for Katie and the folding table and the clean scrubs waiting in 3 separate piles. She moved through the motions with the same attention she'd given to a mortuary flagfold back in 2003, each movement deliberate, each crease precise. Smooth the shoulder seam. Fold the sleeves inward. Fold the hem up to the neckline. Fold again. The cloth was warm from the industrial dryer and it released that antiseptic smell, bleach and heat and the ghost of 1,000 shifts. She could feel it ending. The way the laundry room had gone quiet when she'd entered. The way the charge nurse hadn't met her eyes during the inventory handoff. The way Dr. Ashford's office door had opened and closed 3 times in the last hour, each time followed by the sound of his voice, careful and measured, behind closed glass. She folded another scrub set. The material soft under her hands. She'd been invisible here for 2 years. The kind of invisible that came from asking for nothing, taking nothing, speaking only when necessary, fading into the background of other people's lives. Her hands moved. Fold. Crease. Smooth. The precision was automatic now, muscle memory from a different life, a different uniform, a different way of folding things that mattered. She thought about the patient. About his voice recognizing her. About the charge nurse's expression shifting from routine competence to something else entirely. Realization. Fear, maybe. That word had gotten out. That Katie Morrison wasn't just Katie Morrison. The envelope was waiting in her locker at 4:42 p.m. Standard white. Her name printed on the front in Arial 12 point. She didn't open it in the locker room because opening it there would require a reaction, and reactions were things other people did. She turned it over once in her hands. The paper was still warm. Fresh off a printer. She'd been terminated while folding scrubs downstairs. The process had been efficient. She slipped the envelope into her jacket pocket, the corner pressing against her ribs. She walked out through the main corridor instead of the staff exit, and nobody stopped her. Nobody even looked. It was a Tuesday in early March and Katie Morrison was leaving Oak Creek Memorial Hospital for what she thought was the last time, and the surgical wing and the trauma bay and the fluorescent lights humming their endless hum were all receding into the past tense. The parking lot was bright with afternoon sun. Her car was a 2009 Honda Civic, pale blue, unremarkable. She'd chosen it specifically for that reason. She sat in the driver's seat for 4 minutes with the door open and the termination notice still in her pocket. The letter cited persistent insubordination. It cited failure to comply with shift assignments. It cited concerns about professional boundaries. It was a masterpiece of vague accusations, each one technically defensible and collectively devastating. There were no specifics because specifics could be challenged. There was only the weight of paperwork and authority and the suggestion that Katie Morrison had somehow failed at a job she'd been performing flawlessly for 2 years. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine caught. She was reaching for the gear shift when the first scream cut through the air from the direction of the surgical wing. Not a medical scream. Not a patient sound. A raw, human sound of absolute fury and grief. Then another voice, louder, a man's voice shouting words she couldn't quite make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Rage. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel, the engine idling, and every instinct that had been quiet for 2 years suddenly went live. The surgical wing doors burst outward and a man emerged, 6'4" and gaunt with the particular thinness of someone running on nothing but adrenaline and pain. His hair was matted. His shirt was wrinkled. His right hand held a gun with the kind of grip that meant he knew how to use it, and Katie's entire system registered this in half a second. She watched him turn in the parking lot, searching, wild-eyed. She watched staff members scatter like drop papers in a wind, diving back through doors, running for cover, the parking lot emptying in seconds. The gun rose higher, pointed at the afternoon sky. His mouth opened and sound came out, not words but something deeper, the sound of a man who'd lost everything. Katie turned off the engine. She stepped out of the car. She closed the door behind her with deliberate quietness. The man didn't see her yet, his focus on the building, on finding the person he'd come looking for, but she was already moving toward the surgical wing entrance, her pace steady, her hands visible and open. She could feel the weight of the envelope in her jacket pocket pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She could feel the hospital laundry room still on her skin, that antiseptic smell, the ghost of precisely folded cloth. She pushed through the glass doors and the sound of the industrial hinges opening seemed impossibly loud. The man swung toward the sound, the gun following his attention, pointing directly at her center mass. Katie kept her hands where he could see them. She kept her voice at the register that worked on people in crisis, not loud, not soft, just present and sure. "Sir, I need you to lower the weapon." Her voice carried the quality of something that had been tempered, that had survived things that break most people. "Whatever happened, we can talk about it." She was 10 feet away now. 15 was the maximum safe distance. Anything closer was negotiating with a loaded gun. She held the distance. The gunman's hands were trembling, his fingers twitching against the trigger guard, tears streaming down his face. "My son," he said, and the gun dropped slightly. "That doctor killed my son." Behind her, a security guard's voice stammered from somewhere near the nurse's station, "That's, you need to," but Katie was already moving, one slow step forward, hand still visible, her eyes locked on the gunman's face because the face told you everything, the dilation of the pupils, the tightness around the eyes, the way despair and rage were warring behind his expression. A younger man appeared then, maybe 30, maybe younger, trembling from head to toe, holding a sheaf of medical records, his lips moving like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. The father didn't even look at him. He was watching Katie. "Tell me about your son," Katie said. "What was his name?" Dr. Ashford's office door opened. He stood in the frame, pale as the scrubs he was wearing, watching the scene unfold in the hallway below. He saw Katie in the center of it. He saw the gun. He saw the gathering crowd of staff members, faces emerging from patient rooms, all of them bearing witness. His mouth went white at the edges. His hand reached for the door frame to steady himself. And in that moment, standing in his own office, watching the invisible woman he'd been trying to erase become suddenly, catastrophically visible, Dr. Ashford understood that something had irrevocably shifted. The towering man was 6'4", maybe 6'5", his frame filling the surgical wing doorway like a storm front. Unshaven. Wild-eyed. His jacket hung open over a stained white t-shirt that said something about a construction company, and his hands, both of them, shook as he raised the gun high enough that everyone could see it clearly. "Ashford," he screamed, his voice raw and breaking. "I'm looking for Dr. James Ashford. Where is he?" The hallway erupted. A trauma surgeon sprinted backward toward the parking garage. 2 residents disappeared into supply closets. A phlebotomist dropped her cart and bolted for the stairwell. The sound of that cart hitting tile echoed through the emptying corridor, the sharp clang of instruments scattering, the scatter of vacuum tubes rolling across linoleum. Boots on tile. Running footsteps. All of them moving away from the gun. Katie Morrison didn't move. She stood exactly 12 feet from the man's outstretched arms, her own hands visible and open at shoulder height, her voice steady as surgical steel. "My name is Katie. I'm a nurse here. What's your son's name?" The gunman's eyes snapped toward her, confused by the question, by her refusal to run, by the simple acknowledgement of his humanity when everyone else had chosen terror. His hands trembled harder. "What?" "Your son," Katie said, taking one slow step forward. "What's his name?" She didn't raise her voice, didn't make sudden movements. She just asked the question like she had all the time in the world, like they were standing in a coffee shop instead of a hospital hallway where a weapon hung suspended like a promise of violence. Why would you? Because I want to know who I'm standing here for." Another step. 5 feet of concrete and linoleum between them now. The gun barrel wavered slightly, the man's arms beginning to tire from the weight of sustained rage and grief combined. Then a voice cut through the chaos from the far end of the surgical wing, deep, commanding, the kind of voice that had spent decades ordering people into situations where they might not come back. "Stand down for Major Morrison." A decorated military officer in full dress uniform strode forward, the uniform so crisp the creases looked like they could draw blood. Colonel insignia. Combat infantry badge. 2 rows of ribbons, the medals stacked like a chronicle of wars. Behind him moved another figure, shoulder-wide, compact, with the particular stillness of someone who'd learned early that excessive movement was a waste of energy. A SEAL team leader, his bearing like a coiled spring wrapped in human skin. The gunman's attention fractured, pulled between Katie and the uniform approaching from his left. The SEAL team leader gripped his shoulder, not rough, not aggressive, just a hand on fabric that communicated more authority than any weapon ever could. "Sir, my name is Lieutenant Commander Hayes. I served with Major Morrison in Tikrit, 2011. She saved my entire team. Pulled us out of an ambush with nothing but gauze and will, and she didn't stop moving until every one of us was stable." The gunman's hands began to lower, the gun tilting toward the floor. Hayes continued, his voice even. "Whatever happened to your son, she didn't do it. And I'm asking you, as a man who trusts her with his life, to stand down." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the weapon dropped. It hit the tile with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence, and the gunman's entire frame collapsed into a chair someone had wheeled over. He began to cry, the kind of crying that doesn't make sound, just shaking shoulders and tears that refuse to stop. An FBI agent arrived within minutes, moving through the crowd with credentials extended like a passport to truth. This one was female, dark suit, the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been chasing a conspiracy through bureaucratic channels for weeks. Special Agent Williams. Behind her, 2 additional agents carried files thick enough to require both hands. Dr. James Ashford. Williams called out as Ashford himself emerged from his office doorway, his face the color of hospital walls. "We need you to come with us." He backed up a step, hands rising. "This is a misunderstanding. I was protecting patient safety." Morrison was a liability, untrained, she had no credentials, she was a threat to. Williams cut him off with a file folder extended like a knife. "Your background check request on Katie Morrison triggered automatic protocols due to her security clearance level. That flag brought us in. We pulled your medication logs, cross-referenced them against surgical outcomes for the past 18 months, interviewed pharmacy staff, reviewed your communication records. Your defensive investigation exposed your entire operation." The realization hit Ashford like a physical blow, his own weapon had destroyed him. He'd tried to bury the nurse by requesting her background check, and that request had lit up every federal alarm system tied to her clearance, pulling the FBI down on top of him like a hammer. They led him through the surgical wing in handcuffs, his wrists small and pale above the metal, his medical career ending in front of the staff members he'd bullied and manipulated for years. Past the nurse's station where Katie's empty locker still hung open, the nameplate still reading Morrison in faded letters. Past the supply closet where he'd cornered her and destroyed her career with careful words. Past the laundry room where she'd folded her final scrubs hours earlier. Past all of it, with staff members lining the hallway in a silence so thick the fluorescent light seemed loud by comparison. The gunman lowered his weapon completely now, grief overwhelming rage. His shoulders heaved. "My son. Marcus. He was 23. He didn't die from his injuries. He died because of what this man did to him during surgery." Katie approached slowly, her movement deliberate and patient, the way you approach something wounded and dangerous at the same time. Her voice, when it came, was gentle. "I'm so sorry. Your son deserved better care. He deserved someone who was fighting for him, not against him." The SEAL team leader retrieved Katie's personnel file from the charge nurse's shaking hands. Williams had handed it over as part of the arrest warrant, and read aloud for the assembled staff. His voice was steady and clear. Multiple commendations. Expert field medic rating. Trained trauma surgeons in combat medicine under fire. Medical discharge due to injury sustained while evacuating wounded under fire. Special Forces, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. He paused, let the weight of that settle. Major Catherine Morrison. Honorable discharge. Decorated service. The hospital administrator arrived then, pale and breathless, clutching a phone like it might explode. "Major Morrison, I've just spoken with our board. Your termination is voided. We'd like to discuss your immediate reinstatement." Katie nodded, accepting the words without ceremony. She turned to the gunman. "I want to help with the complaint. With making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else's son." He nodded, unable to speak, his entire body bent under the weight of grief deferred and rage finally released. 3 years passed the way 3 years do, quietly, filled with small decisions and slower transformations. Dr. Ashford sat at a folding table in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation office, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt with an insurance company logo. His hands, once decorated with a Rolex that cost more than most people's cars, now pushed supplemental health insurance pamphlets across cheap laminate. His medical license was gone. His reputation was ash. The 18 families who'd testified at his trial had made sure of that, each one speaking about a loved one who died from his deliberate negligence, from vials swapped in the darkness, from his hunger to cover something up. Back at Oak Creek Memorial, Katie Morrison stood in the surgical wing wearing her scrubs again. The faded Special Forces unit patch was sewn visibly onto her jacket now, no longer hidden, the fabric worn soft from being touched thousands of times. The charge nurse handed her a trauma case file. Multiple GSW, 3 minutes out. Your lead. Katie nodded, that small, confident gesture that communicated everything. No longer invisible. No longer invisible. The gunman's son worked as a patient advocate now, pushing the hospital toward transparency policies, his father having received mandatory counseling instead of charges after the FBI confirmed his son's death was medically preventable. The SEAL team leader visited quarterly, bringing other veterans to meet with Katie about transitioning to civilian medical careers. She'd created a trauma protocol training program, teaching residents the improvised techniques that kept soldiers alive when supplies ran out. In the break room one morning, a new nurse asked about the patch on Katie's jacket. Katie paused, set down her coffee. It reminds me who I was before I had to prove it again. The hospital PA system crackled to life, Major Morrison to Trauma 1. She stood, moved down the hallway with the particular confidence of someone who'd survived and come back stronger. Staff members stepped aside with nods of respect, not deference, but the kind of acknowledgement you give to someone who's already proven themselves in the places that matter. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same hallway where she'd once tried to disappear, where she'd folded her final scrubs, where she'd walked toward a gun instead of away from it. The difference was in the eyes watching her move. The difference was that everyone here knew her name. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story, if you've ever had to hide who you really were, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Would you have walked toward the gunman or away? What does it take for the world to finally see you? Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.